Hi, so today we're going to be talking about the different types of ACE essay that you can expect to see regarding poetry. So we're going to cover the three major types of prompt that you are going to expect to encounter, and we're going to talk about the different papers that you are going to find them on. And then we are going to actually take a look at some of those prompts and kind of apply what we have learned to those prompts and talk about how we can, write a thesis for those, and then how we can structure those different essays. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the different types of essays that you and prompts that you'll encounter and where you'll see them. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. Okay, if you are looking for this PowerPoint outside of this presentation or outside of this video, you can find it in our Teams section. It's under the files and it is available there, so you'll be able to see it there and not just as part of this presentation. You should also have gotten a hard copy of most of the slides in class, so you should have access to this in any number of ways. The first thing to talk about are the specific papers that you will see these different poetry prompts come up on. And so the first is paper 1, which is drama and poetry. Again, AS level, we know that. So you'll be seeing you'll be writing on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There will be 2 prompt choices, so an open prompt and a passage prompt. So this will actually look a lot like what we saw for The Handmaid's Tale, where there is a larger kind of thematic prompt about that longer narrative poem, which we will obviously be starting next week. And then there will be a specific prompt about a passage that is given to you, and you will be asked to analyze the passage in light of the guidance given in that prompt. For both of those prompts, there will be guidance and focus given in the prompt for the aspect of the poem that they want you to focus on in your writing. Paper 2 we know is prose and unseen, again AS level, and so there is the possibility that you will see this on the exam. Again, we never know which 2 of our 3 genres will be reflected in paper 2, because again, we study prose, poetry, and drama. There are 2 of those 3 genres that will show up in the prompts, and you get to choose one of those. So poetry might be an option. You can choose that if it is, but again, you're going to be writing one of the 2 prompts that is back there. And then you will see them again on paper 4, which is our pre and post 1900 poetry and prose test. That is A level. And so we are starting our study of that right now. That is Emily Dickinson for our poetry, is The Handmaid's Tale for our prose. And so again, we'll have 2 choices for this, and we're going to be talking about those in just a moment as well. So here are the prompts. I know this looks like a lot, but we're just going to kind of go through this. So for paper 1, like we just talked about, for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, this is actually the first year in 2023, 2022, 2023 school year, that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight will be actually on the test. And so what I've used as your examples are actually examples that are Chaucer examples. So again, another longer narrative poem. And so these are pretty good exemplars of what you can expect to see, because we don't have any Sir Gawain prompts to pull yet. But looking at these Chaucer prompts, we can see what you can expect to encounter when you get to the paper 1 Sir Gawain prompts. And so for the open essay, it says, in what ways and with what effects does Chaucer present different kinds of love in The Knight's Tale? So again, you can see that large thematic idea of like different kinds of love. And then for a prompt B, it says, paying close attention to poetic methods, analyze the following extract showing what it adds to Chaucer's presentation of Arcite in The Knight's Tale. Obviously, you don't know who that character is because you have not read that text, but you can see that they are giving you a character that you should focus your writing on. So there is a focus in that particular prompt, and then there would be a passage following it, and you can see that where it says analyze the following extract. So you would have the prompt, and then immediately after that you would have your passage that you would be asked to analyze, and you would be asked to analyze it in light of this particular character. For paper 2, this would be an example of an unseen prompt. It says, discuss the presentation of the storm and its effect in the following poem. In your answer, consider choice of language, imagery, and structure. And so this is, again, you would have that prompt immediately followed by the poem. And so you would be asked to think about how the storm and its effects that, you're given in the poem, how that is presented to you. You would need to say something specific about that, not just like there is a storm, it happens. You would need to talk about how the storm is presented. Again, just like we talked about when it says things like language, imagery, and structure, those are not prescriptive. You do not have to write about those things. Those are just kind of reminders that Cambridge is giving you, like, hey, you can talk about these things, you're not required to. Our last thing to look at here, this is for paper 4. You have a comparison prompt and a critical prompt. And so it's a little bit different than what we saw in paper 1. So let's look at the A prompt. It says, in what ways and with what effects does Lockhead present memories in her poetry? You should refer to 3 poems from the selection in your answer. So in this example, you are given that focus of memories, and you are also given the direction for the number, 3 poems. And this is what we're seeing for this A-level prompt, is that they're giving you a specific focus, and that they're asking you to talk about 3 of the different works. And so this is something that you will be asked to do for Dickinson. They'll give you a focus, and then they will ask you to talk about 3 poems that respond to or that are connected to that focus. Just like with our Handmaid's Tale kind of open prompt and comparison prompt, you are not going to have your text full of notes and full of all of your poems in front of you. They are going to expect that you have those quotes in your brain. So we have to make sure that we have that. So that is our first one. We're going to come back and talk about how we might structure these things. And then the last thing that we want to look at are the critical essay prompts. For this A prompt, and again, for both of these B prompts right here, these would both be followed by a specific poem. So for this B prompt, it says, write a critical appreciation of the following poem. Consider how far it is characteristic of the poet's methods and concerns. So they would ask you basically to come up with your own kind of focus, which we've kind of talked about before, and then talk about how it is representative of, the way that this poet writes in general. And so you would need to talk about the things that you see in this poem that you see in other poems by this particular author. We can also have this other type of structure that's asking you to do the same thing. It's just kind of worded a little bit differently. It says, discuss the following poem, considering Auden's presentation of time here and elsewhere in the selection. When it's talking about the selection, it's talking about overall. So when we're talking about Dickinson, right, you would get a particular Dickinson poem, and they would be asking you to analyze that particular poem, and then also kind of connect that outward to the ways that it connects to other poems in your Dickinson book, right? That's what it means by the selection, because it's the selection of poems that we are studying together. So that is what that means. So those are our prompts. So we're going to take a closer look at some of these prompts together in a couple minutes. But again, just as a reminder how to read a prompt, if there's any contextual information, this is really for the paper 2 unseen stuff. Pay attention to that. Think about what you are being asked to do. Are you being asked to compare? Are you being asked to contrast? Are you being asked to think about a particular, type of thing? And then again, what specific main idea are you supposed to address? This is mostly for papers 1 and 2 because these prompts are going to give you a focus for the essay. Paper 4 may give you a particular aspect to focus on, but sometimes it just tells you to write a critical commentary, remember that you should always, always, always articulate some sort of specific focus in your thesis. You have to say something specific in your thesis. It's not going to be enough to just simply repeat what the prompt says. You have to expand on that. You have to say something more specific than what the prompt is giving you. You have to come up with your own idea, because again, that becomes the P part of the rubric, the personal response part of the rubric. I do want you guys to take a look at the elements to consider handout. If you are in class and you received this in class, it's on the back of the PowerPoint printout that I gave you. And so, just as always, it has some of the sample prompts, the ones that we just looked at on the back. And then underneath that, it goes through a lot of the things that Cambridge expects you to be able to know, and to be able to identify and to discuss in a sophisticated way when you talk about these different poems. Um, a couple things that I do want to say about this, just as a reminder. We've spent a lot of time talking about poetic structure just because I know that that's something you guys haven't had a lot of instruction in recently. And so you guys have a lot of that in your brains right now. I do want to remind you that if you are going to point out things like rhythm and meter, if you're going to point out things like rhyme scheme, if you're going to point out things like sound devices such as alliteration, consonants, rhyme, that kind of good stuff, you have to be able to tell me what the effect of that is. What is important about that? Why do we need to know this? It's not enough to just be able to kind of point at it and wave at it, be like, hello, I can tell you that this is iambic tetrameter. You have to tell me why that's significant. Um, if you are not able to tell me why it's significant, then you're not necessarily doing anything except kind of showing off that you can do it. If there is a shift in the rhyme scheme, then yeah, that is important. What is the link between the content of the poem and the shift in that rhyme scheme or in that rhythm and meter? You need to make sure that you can make those connections, and discuss the significance and discuss the effect. You always want to be able to discuss effect. That's one of the most important things. So, in general, when you are writing one of these essays, regardless of what your prompt is, you have to have a thesis that provides a focus. What is the main concern of your essay? What are you arguing? What's your main point? That is the P part of your rubric. And then you have to make sure that you have a clear organizational structure. We're going to talk more about this in just a second, but the organization has to be clear and apparent. And every paragraph has to have a clear and specific focus. So we're looking for organization on the essay level as well as on the paragraph level. The other thing you need to make sure that you're doing as you are creating this organizational structure is that you are incorporating specific quotations from the poem or poems that you're discussing. Again, direct quotes. This is very important. Okay, so the first type of prompt that we are going to talk about is the A prompt, the open prompt for paper one, for poetry and prose. So this is the first option that you will have when you are writing about Sir Gawain. So this is one where you are going to be given kind of a thematic question with a focus that addresses the entire text, because again, Sir Gawain is a narrative poem. So it's going to feel a little bit more like you are actually writing about prose, because it is this longer narrative poem. And so in your open essay, should you choose to write it, you are going to have a thesis that clearly specifies something about the focus that you've been given. And so you are given some sort of focus or link in the prompt, like this idea of different kinds of love, as we see in our sample prompts, but you need to say something more specific about that. So you would need to name the different types of love that you want to talk about. You would need to talk about, what, kind of areas of love you want to focus on, something along those lines. And then one of the things that you would want to think about is how you are going to structure this essay. The nice thing is that because this is a narrative poem, a lot of the structures for the open essay for prose work for this type of essay as well. And so, all of the ones from our previous PowerPoint, things like chronological organization, where you talk about your focus at the beginning, middle, and end of the poem. You can organize it by narrative or literary element, where you talk about these particular characters and how they show these, for example, different types of love. or these different characters in relationships and how those illustrate, the different types of love that you're talking about. Conflict setting, any kind of thematic elements, any of the things that we talked about when we discussed the open prompt and the Handmaid's Tale, all of those work, or any other organizational pattern that makes sense for this prompt and that is clear and apparent and that you lay out clearly in your thesis, and that is that you're able to communicate to your reader. One of the ways that you do that is by having a clear and specific assertion for each paragraph, and making sure that you have that organization, not just at the essay level, but like I said, at the paragraph level as well. What are you addressing in each paragraph? So when we go to paper 4 and we look at the A prompt for paper 4, it's very different because instead of talking about one longer narrative poem, we are going to be talking about a selection of poems from Emily Dickinson. So in this case, you are writing what we're calling the comparison essay. And so for this, you are going to have a thesis that clearly names all the poems that you're going to address. Because again, in this one, you are going to have a focus, and then you are going to be asked to think about like how how 3 of these different poems show you this focus. And so your thesis has to name all the poems that you're going to address, and then tell me something more specific about that link. You can't just say, hey, they all show death, they all show failed hopes, they all show love. Well, what specific aspect of that focus is being shown to you through these 3 poems? What specific aspect are you focusing on in your writing? So one possible useful structure is to comment on the first poem in a paragraph, comment on the second poem in a paragraph. And when I say comment, I mean like do the analysis with a focus on, what you've been given in your thesis and in your prompt. Comment on the third poem in a paragraph, and then in your fourth paragraph, comment on the links between those poems and the significance of those links. What is interesting to you? What is this showing you about Emily Dickinson's kind of methods and concerns? What is it that she is thinking about when she is considering these ideas, and thinking about overall, how is she presenting this idea to you through, the works of the selection. Going kind of backwards, when we are thinking about the critical essay, the B prompt, this is going to be similar for all of our papers, no matter what, because again, you are going to have a poem or a part of a poem that is provided for you. And so this is something that we feel pretty familiar with. So you are going to have you're going to have the prompt, and then immediately following the prompt, you are going to have that passage, if it is, or that excerpt from the poem, if we are talking about paper 1 in Sir Gawain, or you are going to have a poem that you've never seen if it's paper 2, or you are going to have one of the Dickinson poems if we are talking paper 4. So the prompt itself will give you some sort of major idea to focus on. So some sort of like presentation of a character, some sort of thematic idea like memories, like we see in our example for paper 2, the presentation of the storm. Or we know that in paper 4, sometimes they ask you to come up with your own kind of idea to think about. But we do need to have some sort of major of focus that you are articulating and that you are saying something specific about. Then when you go for the organization, this part's easy. It's the top down, top to bottom analysis. This is exactly the same as to what we do for passage analysis essays. So top to bottom analysis. And you might be thinking like, great, how do I do that for a poem? I'm used to doing that for a prose passage. How do I do that for a poem? We're going to talk more about that in a moment, but generally speaking, you can use the structure of the poem to help you create your paragraphs, just kind of like you would use paragraphs and kind of divide them up where you saw the shifts. You're going to basically do the same thing, except for you're going to be looking at stanzas. So when we're thinking about like A Narrow Fellow in the Grass by Dickinson, it has 5 stanzas. What are ways that you can group or divide them that are going to make sense? For paper 4, just as a reminder, you have to be able to talk about what the poet is doing in that particular poem that you have been given, as well as being able to connect that out to other poems in the selection, either through the kind of common structures that you see being used in that poem, that you see being used in other poems, that Dickinson is talking about, or kind of thematically, what is she talking about in this poem that she talks about in other poems? Why is that significant? Ideally, like it says, you'll be able to do both. So the rubric, luckily, is the same, knowledge and understanding. So familiar with the text, can use appropriate quotations. That's easy for our B prompts because the excerpt is there for you. Maybe a little bit harder for the A prompts, whether it's the open prompt like we see for paper 1, or whether it is the compare prompt like we see for the Dickinson for paper 4, where you have to have quotes for 3 different poems in your brain. You still have to do the analysis. We cannot neglect our analysis, especially with poetry. We have to be able to identify and comment on the effect of the structure, form, and language that you are identifying. And then, of course, our personal commentary, the P part, which is connecting it back to the major idea that you have articulated in your thesis. And then we have our last part, the communication. So again, fluency, more than just correct spelling and correct conventions. We are thinking about the sophistication of your communication in general. And that is it for our kind of overview of the essays. Now is take a couple minutes, and I'd like to go through and look at these prompts, especially for the Dickinson stuff, and kind of talk through how you would approach these and how you could write a thesis for these and how you could organize these essays, just so that way we have some sort of idea before we go into even more major poetry study. So we're going to look first of all at this A prompt. We're gonna not do the Sir Gawain stuff like the open prompt, because that again is so much like what we have done for The Handmaid's Tale that I feel pretty good about that. I feel like we know how to do that. This is very different, where we have to look at this particular idea and then name the poems and all that kind of good stuff. So let's look at this first prompt, and y'all have these prompts. You were given these prompts in class. And again, if you don't have this with you, then you can access it in our team section in the files. And so you should have a paper copy of this. So when we are looking at the A prompt, it says, discuss some of the effects created by Dickinson's presentation of death. You should refer to 3 poems in your answer. So the first thing that you would want to do is figure out, like, great, what is our major idea? And of course, that is thinking about Dickinson's presentation of death. And so for me, the easiest thing to think about is, okay, great, this is our major idea. What are the poems that I feel confident and comfortable using that address this particular idea? And so as I was going through and thinking about this, and I know that you guys have not studied all of these yet, but we can still walk through this. We can still think about this. We can still talk about this. The first one is because I could not stop for death. So we would talk about that one. The second I would use would be I felt a funeral in my brain. That's an N, in my brain. And the third one that I would use would be, this world is not conclusion. So those would be the 3 that I would choose to talk about here. And of course, they are all about death. Because I could not stop for death has a lot of personification of death itself. So that is kind of the major device that we see is the personification of death. Um, the second one, I felt a funeral in my brain. There is a lot of personification and also like this idea of like a metaphor of like the death of the speaker's consciousness. Excuse my hands, my screen just went dark. And then for my third one, it says, this world is not conclusion. So that says consciousness. I apologize for my terrible writing. This world is not conclusion. There is personification again of a lot of kind of like abstract ideas. Like philosophy and faith and things like that. So as we're thinking about that, one of the things that I would talk about, or one of the things that I would do with this when I was writing my thesis, like when I would be talking about like her presentation of death, I would end up talking about, I think, like how she presents death. That she tends to present death as a figure that can be met and known. And so like this idea of like familiarity is something that we see in a lot of Dickinson's poems. So with this idea of familiarity, one of the things that I would focus on is looking at how all of these different types of like personification in each of these poems add to this idea of familiarity. And so my organization for this particular essay would go through and talk about how that is accomplished in each poem. And then I would talk about how so again, one paragraph for each of these. So this would become paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3. And then I would also, this would become my thesis. I would also want to have a paragraph 4 for this essay that talked about how we see this happening in other places. So in that case, I might talk about how she personifies other abstract ideas, or that idea of like the concrete to the abstract that we have discussed. And I would want to name those poems. I would also want to kind of connect that maybe to her biography in a very, very succinct and general way. Like, you don't want to write a biographical essay on this, but talking about how this idea of a personal relationship here with death is interesting, given the fact that she is maybe not forming physical relationships with other people, and so we see the personification of her relationships with other kind of with ideas rather than people, which is interesting. So this would become kind of like your final paragraph. So this is and this is connecting out to the whole selection. So this is all for our A prompt, for that comparison prompt. Let's take a look at our B prompt.
I'm going to change colors so that way we can kind of differentiate between the two. So when we're looking at our B prompt, this one, of course, is going to deal with the poem that is right here, "A Narrow Fellow in the Grass." If you were present in class, then this is one that we have analyzed together today. And so what we want to look at, first of all, is the prompt. And the prompt says, analyze the following poem, showing what it adds to your understanding of Dickinson's methods and concerns here and elsewhere in the selection. So this is one of the ones where it just basically says, like it's like a choose your own adventure prompt. So choose your own focus. So what we need to think about with this prompt is, what is her focus here? Like, what is it that she is trying to communicate to us overall, and how can we kind of, expand that outward? And so when we are thinking about that, we would want to make sure that in your thesis that you have a specific focus, and that you specifically articulate a focus. And it needs to, again, be specific. So you can't just say that she is discussing nature. You can't just say that she is discussing how she feels about nature even. That's not specific enough. You need to tell me about what she is actually feeling, and the significance of that. So you need to make sure that you are giving me a specific statement about that in your thesis. So that's going to be the first thing that you need to do, is make sure that you have a thesis in which you articulate a specific focus about what she is doing here. And then when you have that, the next thing you want to think about is your organization. You'll notice I'm not marking this poem, and again, that is because we spent a lot of time with this in class, and so you guys should already have the marking for this. But what we want to think about is organization. So you want to think about, like, how can I divide this poem? And we want to think about that. This is similar to how you would divide a passage for a passage analysis essay. So this is similar to dividing a passage. So you would want to think about dividing it into, I would say, 3 to 4 sections. And I say that because, 2 is not enough. And always when you are thinking organization, you want to think about shifts, because that's going to be an easy place to make those divisions. So easy to divide at the shifts. And remember that shifts can happen in poetry in lots of different places and in lots of different ways. They can happen where we have the breaks. They can, the actual stanza and verse breaks. They can happen when there's a shift in content. They can happen when there is a shift in tone. They can happen when there's a shift in the sound devices with rhythm and meter, with rhyme scheme, a shift in the rhyme scheme, a shift in the connotative language, all of that kind of stuff. So think about where the shifts are happening, and that will help you make those divisions. So after that, we then want to basically, once you've done your divisions, then you write your essay. So each paragraph is going to make sure that it has a focus. You've divided it. So what is your first paragraph's focus, or your first section's focus? What is your second section's focus? What is your third and or fourth section's focus? You want to make sure that you are continuing to do the analysis of the devices that you see, not just identification, and then the connection back to your thesis. So you are thinking back to, like, what is it that I had to say in my thesis about what's going on in this particular poem. And the other thing, again, because this is a paper 4 thing, again, this is going to be specific to paper 4 because it deals with the methods and concerns whole thing. You want to think about, like, hey, how is this similar to other poems that I see? How can I connect this to the rest of the selection? How is this representative is a good word. How is this representative of Dickinson in, like, content, like what she actually writes about, in, like, structure, in form, in language. Ooh, I'm running off the page. So you would take all of the marking that we did and kind of apply it to all of these things right here. So what's a good specific kind of focus for this essay? What is she kind of trying to tell you? What is the message that she's trying to get across to you? How can you divide this poem into 3 to 4 sections using the shifts to kind of help you get to this point? And then you are going to write the essay so that each paragraph has its own focus, that you are doing the analysis of all the devices that we looked at, and that you are thinking about in a real general way, like, does each paragraph have, like, a sentence or two that accomplishes this whole part to whole thing that you guys got used to in Lang. We're not moving away from that. We're still doing the part to whole thing. So that is what we are looking at for dealing with these types of prompts. So just so that we are remembering exactly what we are supposed to be doing with this, the A prompt is that we're looking at here is for Dickinson. So again, this is for paper 4. This is going to be our A-level paper, and so we want to think about, of course, the specific idea that we want to say in our thesis or articulate in our thesis about death. We've got that up here. We want to make sure that in the thesis that we name the 3 poems that we're going to talk about, which we've got right here. I know that we have not read all of these. I kind of went through and told us about what was going on with that. And then I've kind of marked for you how we might organize this. So again, paragraph 1 is about our first poem. Paragraph 2 is about our second. Paragraph 3 is about our third. All of them, of course, are analyzing each of these specific poems in terms of this idea in our thesis. And then paragraph 4 is looking at how these kind of all tie together, and then also how we can think about how she uses these same kind of ideas in general in some of her other poems, right? About how she's personifying other abstract ideas, about how she maybe moves from the concrete to the abstract in other ideas or in other poems, about how she maybe uses some of the same kind of general terms or the same general kind of structure, form, and language elements that we want to think about. And then also we can maybe connect that to some of her, like, biographical things. But again, do not get overexcited about the biographical stuff. That is baby if we put that in at all. But again, paragraph 4 kind of ties it all together. And that is going to be very different than what we're going to be doing for Sir Gawain. Sir Gawain, that type of A prompt, that type of open essay, that's going to look a lot more like what we would do for The Handmaid's Tale, because again, that is a longer narrative poem, and so it's going to give you that kind of, like, large thematic idea, and you're going to talk about that thematic idea over the course of the entire text. It's just that you're talking about it in terms of a poem instead of in terms of a novel. The other thing that we want to think about here is our second is our second poem and our second prompt. And so this again is our this is our poem that we're looking at here that has the critical prompt and then our poem that follows it. This is something that we're going to see in each one of our papers. So paper 1 we're going to see this for Sir Gawain. It's just going to give you a specific focus, unlike what we see here. Paper 2 is again our unseen. Maybe we'll have a poetry one, we'll find out. But again, it's going to also give you a focus, so unlike what we see here. And then here's an example of paper 4 for Dickinson. It gives you the poem, does not give you the focus. This is a choose your own focus kind of prompt, and so you have to read the poem, you have to choose your own focus and articulate that in your thesis. And then of course we talked about how you would organize this poem by dividing it into 3 to 4 sections, using the shifts as a guide, and then making sure that as you write your essay, each paragraph has its own focus, that you are analyzing the devices, connecting them back to your thesis, and then of course again thinking about that connection back to the rest of the selection, again that part to whole. So that is our very, very general recap of what this looks like for each of the essays. Again, like I mentioned before, we're doing this with the Dickinson poetry because we quite literally do not have Sir Gawain prompts to look at, since this is the first year that that has kind of cycled into our AICE Lit set text list. So this is what we've got going on.
Okay, so that is our quick lesson on the different types of poetry essays that you are going to encounter on the ACE exam. Just as a quick reminder, we're going to see them on 3 of our 4 papers. So you are going to see them on paper 1, which is drama and poetry. You are going to see them on paper 2, which is the prose and unseen. And then you are going to see them again on paper 4, which is our pre and post 1900 poetry and prose. So again, the PowerPoint that we went over in this lesson is actually in our Teams file. So if you would like to go look at that without having to like hear the background noise of me talking, that is available there. The prompt sheet that we went over is also available there, as is the Elements to Consider handout. You should have also received those in class as hard copies as well. So all of that is available to you there. This video is also available to you at any point because it is just up on the internet, which is one of my favorite things. So if you have questions about any of the things that we went over today or that I talked about today, please make sure that you write that down, bring it to class, and so that way we can have a chance to that I can have a chance to answer your questions next time I see you, just so that way we can make sure that we are all on the same page, that we're not staying confused about anything, and that we are kind of getting where we need to be and making sure that we understand everything we need to understand before we move into actually writing these essays. So please bring any questions that you have about how to address these essays or about how to organize them or about how to approach them. Make sure that you bring those to class so that way we can get those questions answered. Otherwise, thanks so much, and I will see you soon.